History is filled with golden ages of progress and peace, but also with moments of devastation so severe they shape the future of entire civilizations. Today, we'll travel century by century, uncovering the worst years humanity endured, from natural disasters and pandemics to invasions, wars, and collapse. The first century, 79 AD, the eruption of Vesuvius. In 79 AD, one of the most famous natural disasters in history struck southern Italy. Mount Vesuvius erupted with unimaginable force. A massive column of ash, smoke, and molten rock shot 33 kilometers into the sky, raining debris on nearby towns. The Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum were wiped off the map. But it wasn't just ashfall. Pyroclastic surges, walls of superheated gas, and volcanic material moving faster than a hurricane raced down the slopes, incinerating everything in their path. People were buried alive in their homes, their final moments preserved in ash. The eruption released 100,000 times more energy than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Survivors described days of darkness, poisonous air, and unending tremors. Thousands died instantly, and the cities remained lost until rediscovered centuries later. This year marked how fragile human civilization was in the face of nature's wrath. The second century, 165 AD, the Antonine Plague. By the mid-2nd century, the Roman Empire stood as the strongest force on earth. But in 165 AD, an invisible killer struck, the Antonine Plague. Likely smallpox or measles, the disease spread rapidly as Roman soldiers returned from campaigns in the east. In city after city, death tolls soared. Entire communities vanished. Over 5 million people perished. Some estimates go as high as 10 million. Rome's mighty legions were crippled, trade with India and Southeast Asia collapsed, and the empire's economy began to falter. The plague didn't just kill, it destabilized the Roman world. Farmers abandoned fields, food production plummeted, and panic spread. Even the co-emperor Lucius Verus succumbed to the disease. What had been the height of Roman power suddenly became a warning. No empire, no matter how strong, is immune to nature. The 3rd century, 251 AD. The plague of Cyprian in 251 AD. Another wave of devastation swept across the Roman Empire, the Plague of Cyprian. Named after Saint Cyprian, who documented its horrors, the epidemic may have been smallpox, measles, or even hemorrhagic fever. The death toll was staggering. In Rome alone, 5,000 people died each day. This plague struck during Rome's crisis of the 3rd century, a time of invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse. Emperor Decius, desperate for divine help, ordered mass sacrifices to the old Roman gods. Christians refused to participate, leading to brutal persecutions. Disease became not only a biological disaster, but a religious and political one too. The empire staggered, weakened, and fractured. The 4th century, 365 AD. The Great Earthquake and Tsunami on July 21, 365 AD, one of history's deadliest natural disasters, struck the eastern Mediterranean. A massive earthquake, estimated at magnitude 8 or higher, hit near Crete. The quake unleashed a tsunami that devastated coastal cities from Greece to Egypt. In Alexandria, tens of thousands were killed as towering waves swept miles inland, destroying homes and ships alike. Survivors reported ships stranded in fields and bodies floating in the streets. But nature wasn't the only threat. Around this time, the Huns were beginning their migrations westward, pushing tribes like the Goths into Roman lands. These mass movements destabilized Europe, setting off a chain reaction of wars and invasions. Just over a decade later, in 378 AD, the Battle of Adrianople saw the Goths annihilate a Roman army and kill Emperor Valens. The empire was never the same. The year 365 marked both natural devastation and the beginning of forces that would unravel Rome. The 5th century, 410 AD, the sack of Rome. For centuries, Rome had been untouchable. But in 410 AD, the Eternal City fell. Led by King Alaric, the Visigoths stormed through Rome's gates. For 3 days, the city was plundered, its treasures looted, and its citizens massacred or enslaved. This was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been conquered by a foreign enemy. The psychological shock was enormous. To Romans and the wider world, the empire no longer seemed invincible. Later in the century, Attila the Hun swept across Gaul in 451 AD, devastating everything in his path. The Western Roman Empire was collapsing, torn apart by external invasions and internal weakness. The 6th century, 536 AD, the worst year to be alive. Historians often call 536 AD the worst year in human history. A mysterious series of volcanic eruptions shrouded the earth in ash. For 18 months, the sun barely shone. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, people saw the sun as only a dim shadow. Summer snow fell in China. Crops failed. Famine spread. Temperatures dropped, creating what's now known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Entire economies collapsed, and desperate populations turned to superstition and violence. This catastrophe was followed just a few years later by the Plague of Justinian, which wiped out 1/3 of the Byzantine Empire. A century of disaster had begun with 536 AD. 7th century, 664 AD. The Yellow Plague in 664 AD, Britain and Ireland were ravaged by the Yellow Plague. Entire monasteries, the heart of education, religion, and culture, were wiped out. Kings and clerics alike succumbed. The disease destabilized communities and erased centuries of progress. Earlier in the century, in 632 AD, the death of the Prophet Muhammad had left the Arabian Peninsula in chaos. His passing triggered the Ridda Wars, violent revolts and conflicts within the Muslim community. The century was defined by upheaval and transition. 8th century, 750 AD. The Abbasid Revolution in 750 AD. The Abbasid Revolution erupted, toppling the Umayyad Caliphate in a wave of bloodshed. The Battle of the Zab sealed the Umayyad defeat, and soon after, almost the entire Umayyad family was executed. Civil war and chaos spread through the Islamic world. Power shifted violently, cities burned, and dynasties rose and fell. What had once been unity fractured into strife and instability. 9th century, 865 AD. The Great Heathen Army in 865 AD, England faced total destruction. Unlike earlier Viking raids, this was no hit-and-run attack. The Great Heathen Army arrived, a massive coalition of Viking warriors determined to conquer. Led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, they stormed East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia. Monasteries, centers of wealth and knowledge, were looted. Villages burned. Entire kingdoms fell. The invasion lasted 14 years, shattering England's fragile unity. Thousands perished, and survivors were left in fear of the next raid. 10th century, 907 AD. The collapse of the Tang dynasty in 907 AD, one of the greatest empires in history, collapsed. The Tang dynasty of China fell, plunging the empire into the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period. Warlords fought endlessly, cities were sacked, and peasants were massacred or starved as fields burned. Trade collapsed, famine spread, and millions died. Meanwhile, in Europe, Viking raids still plagued kingdoms, keeping instability alive. Across the Islamic world, the Abbasid Caliphate's decline fueled further chaos. 11th century, 1099 AD. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099. During the First Crusade, Christian knights laid siege to Jerusalem. After weeks of starvation and bombardment, they broke through the walls. What followed was a massacre. Tens of thousands of Muslims and Jews were slaughtered. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was desecrated. The Dome of the Rock became a Christian shrine. The bloodshed deepened divisions between East and West, fueling centuries of conflict. At the same time, Europe suffered famine, disease, and invasions. The Byzantine Empire struggled, while Christian kingdoms in Spain fought against Muslim rule. The world seemed locked in endless war. 12th century, 1138 and 1177 AD, quakes and crusades. In 1138, northern Syria was struck by one of the deadliest earthquakes in history. Aleppo was devastated, and over 200,000 people were killed. Trade routes were destroyed, shifting economic power toward the Italian city-states. Decades later, in 1177, the Crusaders under Baldwin IV won a surprise victory against Saladin at Montgessard. But the triumph only prolonged the bloodshed. Conflict raged on, tearing the Holy Land apart. The 12th century was marked by instability, natural disaster, and the slow unraveling of great empires. 13th century, 1258 AD. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 AD, the Mongols stormed Baghdad. Once the crown jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad was annihilated. Hundreds of thousands were slaughtered. Libraries and knowledge built over centuries were reduced to ash. At the same time, the 1257 eruption of Mount Himalayas in Indonesia triggered global cooling. Harsh winters, famine, and disease spread across the globe. Civilization was brought to its knees. 14th century, 1347 AD. The Black Death in 1347. The Black Death arrived in Europe. Caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the plague spread through fleas and airborne droplets. It killed an estimated 200 million people worldwide. Entire towns were abandoned. Families starved or turned on one another. Priests and doctors died in droves. Many saw the plague as divine punishment. Europe was already weakened by the Great Famine of 1315. The Black Death struck a continent already on its knees, leaving scars that lasted for centuries. 15th century, 1453 AD. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine Empire came to a violent end. The Ottoman Turks, under Mehmed II, stormed Constantinople with massive cannons. The city fell after a brutal siege. Tens of thousands were massacred or enslaved. For Europe, the fall was catastrophic. Trade routes to the east were blocked, refugees flooded westward, and the political map of the world shifted forever. 16th century, 1520 AD. Smallpox in the Americas in 1520, smallpox ravaged the Americas. Introduced by European explorers, the disease spread like wildfire. Indigenous populations had no immunity. In some places, mortality rates reached 90%. The Aztec Empire was devastated. Leaders and warriors died, leaving the Spanish conquest uncontested. Within a year, one of the greatest civilizations on Earth collapsed under disease and invasion. 17th century, 1644 AD. The Ming collapse in 1644. The Ming dynasty fell to internal rebellion and foreign invasion. Civil war engulfed China, while famine and disease claimed millions of lives. The Manchu seized power, founding the Qing dynasty. At the same time, the world was in the grip of the Little Ice Age. Crops failed, economies collapsed, and populations starved. In Russia, famine killed over 2 million people. The century was drenched in suffering. 18th century, 1783 AD. Global famine and ash in 1783, the world endured catastrophe. In India, the Chalisa famine killed up to 11 million people after devastating droughts. In Iceland, the eruption of the Loki volcano spewed toxic gases, killing a quarter of the island's population and poisoning much of Europe's air. Crops failed worldwide. In Africa and India, disrupted monsoons worsened starvation. Across Europe, thousands died from respiratory illness. The earth itself seemed poisoned. 19th century, 1816 AD. The year without a summer. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 set off the year without a summer in 1816. Across the world, harvests failed. In North America, frost and snow hit in June and July. In Europe, endless rain drowned crops. People starved. Riots broke out. In desperation, families ate moss, bark, and stray animals. Millions perished, and mass migrations reshaped populations. The earth had entered a year of darkness. 20th century, 1918 AD. The Spanish flu. As World War I raged, another killer arrived. In 1918, the Spanish flu swept the world, infecting a third of the global population and killing 50 million. The pandemic struck young adults hardest, leaving families shattered. Cities shut down, mass graves filled, and panic spread. War and disease combined to make 1918 one of the deadliest years in human history. Later in the century, World War II brought genocide, atomic destruction, and battles like Stalingrad that killed millions more. Humanity had invented new ways to destroy itself. 21st century, 2020 AD. A year of crisis. In 2020, the world seemed to unravel. The COVID-19 pandemic swept the globe, killing millions, collapsing economies, and forcing billions into lockdown. Loneliness, isolation, and fear spread with the virus. Meanwhile, wildfires ravaged Australia, California, and the Amazon. Locust swarms destroyed crops in Africa and the Middle East. Hurricanes broke records, and the Beirut explosion devastated an entire city. 2020 was not just a year of suffering. It was a reminder that even in our modern world, humanity is never safe from disaster.